We're going to try to live up to the really exceptional quality of the presentations in the last two panels, and to continue with this attempt to provide independent, empirical presentations and analysis. I think the challenge for our group is that we're dealing not with territory and organizations and leadership, but with another fundamental aspect of Al-Qaeda Central's strength and history, which is its role as a source of strategic communications and media operations. And really, if you think back to the narrative of the central organization that Barbara talked so well about in the first panel, and indeed the ambitions that are documented in the minutes of its first meetings, this insight into communication was, I think, always a self-conscious ambition of the group and its leadership, sometimes articulated as such and in other senses intuitive, because Osama bin Laden seemed, for instance, as an individual to understand in the 1990s the power of satellite television to reach around authoritarian regimes in the Middle East before the regimes themselves understood the power of that technology. And from that insight, he created a lot of momentum for himself that may even have surprised him, certainly led him to continuously reevaluate the value of media operations. And today, as a sort of self-described vanguard, Al-Qaeda continues to think of media as an important platform for its ambitions. I think what we'll hear from Dan is that, just as you've heard in other sectors from previous presenters, the details of Al-Qaeda's media operations today are perhaps more complicated and more ridden with internal sort of contradictions to some extent than the broad brush sort of headlines that we often ascribe might suggest. So I look forward to hearing from that. In Dan and Joshua, we have really two of the rising talents in this field of security studies, I think, at least outside the government. Both of them very impressive bodies of work and still a lot of good work to do. Dan is a senior fellow at the Homeland Security Policy Institute. He used to work for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And of course, I have a bias towards people who develop a journalistic method as part of their analytical foundation. And he's the author of a forthcoming paper for New America about Al-Qaeda's use of the internet, and essentially he's going to preview the findings of that paper for you this morning. After Dan will come Josh Geltzer, who is going to run the United States someday. He is currently in training as the editor of the Yale Law Journal. He's the author of a really important piece of work that came out of his doctoral studies at King's College in London, U.S. Counterterrorism Strategy and Al-Qaeda Signaling and the Terrorist Worldview, which is essentially an academic study of American strategic communication in response to Al-Qaeda's strategic communication. And he is a graduate of Princeton, and I guess, do you have your PhD or are you pursuing it? You possess it. Congratulations. Okay, so our narrative then will go from Dan's analysis of Al-Qaeda's strategic communications to Joshua's analysis of American responses, and then we'll take your questions and have a discussion about that. Dan?
Okay, let me begin by thanking the organizers for putting together such an outstanding event and saluting the stamina of everyone who is still in the room. I apologize a little for my voice. I came down with a cold a few days ago, so if I begin to lapse into a Don Corleone delivery, it's not a theatrical effect. It's simply a reflection of my physical condition. I have three topics really to address here today. I'll try to start by outlining the communications challenges that are facing Al-Qaeda and how I think they're responding. I'll talk a little bit about what I think their media strategy is, and then I'll close with some remarks on where we stand, generally we, those of us who would like to see Al-Qaeda fail at this. So let me begin with the communications challenges. Now, how do we define the communications challenges that are facing Al-Qaeda today? I think that there are three key challenges they're facing. The first is, how do they remain prominent in an ever more competitive media environment? This is both online and in other forms of media. The second is, how do they explain their entanglement in the Afghan and Pakistan area? And then third, how do they try to turn the tide of the increasingly negative views of suicide bombing, of bin Laden, of Al-Qaeda, in what is their core constituency, their target audience of the Arab Muslim world. So let me talk a little bit about how I think they are responding or not responding to this. On the communications environment, they are mainly doing what they have done for years. They are continuing to release lots of statements through the Sahab Institute for Media Production, and this is primarily how they are addressing the world. Now, the way that we see Al-Qaeda, the way that the world sees Al-Qaeda, is primarily through leadership statements. Sahab is not 20th Century Fox or a media production institute in the conventional sense, but they do release a certain number of products every year. In 2009, they had about 70 products, and the majority of these are leadership statements. So it is either Ayman al-Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden, or one of the other top figures in Al-Qaeda addressing the world. Sort of the second tier down, we had statements also by some of their members from the West, people like Adam Gadon from the U.S., or Beke Harash, a German member of Al-Qaeda. Even farther down, we have statements from people who are in the Afghan or Pakistani Taliban. Now, what's interesting here, I would say, is that this is a fairly old school and top-down way to communicate with the world, a leadership statement. You have someone who is delivering an address, someone like me here addressing you. This is not interactive. It's not Web 2.0. Al-Qaeda had one brief flirtation with the interactive internet when Zawahiri solicited questions and responded. That experiment, I think, did not work out terribly well for them. It took him months to respond. He responded in voluminous detail, and I think presented quite unconvincing answers to the questions of why Al-Qaeda kills Muslims. But the bottom line here is that Al-Qaeda's communications with the world really remain quite old school and top-down in the form of these leadership statements. Okay. Secondly, I would say that as the media environment has been changing, we don't see Al-Qaeda adapting terribly well. All of us here who live and work in Washington, we are dealing with an explosion of blogging, microblogging, Twitter, user-generated content. I'm sure New America is using half of these things to publicize our event today. Al-Qaeda has not been terribly adept at using these new technologies, and I think there's a very simple reason. The interactive internet is always a trade-off. You are gaining connectivity, but you are generally giving up what we call in most discussions privacy, but what for Al-Qaeda would be security. And through interactivity and user-generated content, you surrender message control. These are two things that are obviously quite dear to Al-Qaeda, controlling the message it sends out and maintaining the security of its members. And they have been largely unwilling to surrender this. It's not as though there is no Al-Qaeda presence on Facebook, but bin Laden does not have a Twitter stream. He does not have a Facebook page. Your reaction to my even bringing it up indicates how implausible it really is and how difficult it is for Al-Qaeda to harness some of these new media methods. This extends to a lesser extent to YouTube. There is Al-Qaeda content on YouTube, but there's a lot of content on YouTube. And if you start to go and search through YouTube, you find two things. The first is that the Al-Qaeda content, whether you search in English or in Arabic or other languages, does not draw enormous, vast view counts. Okay. Second is that the commenting section on YouTube is unfettered. It is an open online environment. It's not like the closed and more closely administered environments of jihadist forums, and people are as likely to praise bin Laden as they are to curse him. Once again, this is not a particularly conducive environment for Al-Qaeda, in part because their success or failure is very much a matter of public record on YouTube. It's very hard to conceal the view counts that your own videos attract on YouTube or to conceal the comments that they draw. So it's not a particularly conducive environment for them. So that's the first communications challenge, the media environment, and I would say they are basically doing what they have always done. On the second count, their involvement, their enmeshment in Afghanistan and Pakistan, we see a very obvious effort to adjust. I noted that the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban figures play a relatively minor role in terms of addressing the world through Sahab, which is closely associated with Al-Qaeda. But the Afghan-Pakistan region is very prominent. If we look at the 70-odd media items that Sahab released in 2009, over 30 of them are focused on the Afghan-Pakistan region. That's clearly the majority of the things that Sahab released in 2009, and it's a very clear focus on the Afghan-Pakistan region. The sort of next category that they address is the global jihad, and then you have smaller amounts on Gaza and Palestine in individual countries. Interestingly, I note, Iraq has not entirely dropped off the map, but is no longer really a focus. The obvious failure of the jihadist project there is not something they want to call attention to. Even as Al-Qaeda is directing a lot of messaging toward Afghanistan and Pakistan and explaining its own place in Afghanistan and Pakistan's place in the global jihadist narrative, it is interesting that their core Arabic-speaking constituency seems somewhat ambivalent about this. I'll spare you all the technical details from my forthcoming paper about how I have surveyed some of the statistical information on Arabic forum environments, but suffice it to say the software builds in all kinds of interesting statistical counters. The upshot is that the Arabic-speaking participants in jihadist forums don't seem terribly interested in the Afghanistan and Pakistan-focused products that Sahab is releasing. They're quite interested in the materials on Gaza and Palestine, the global jihadist things, but Afghanistan and Pakistan seem less thrilling to them. Now, the situation may be different among people in Pakistan, Urdu-speaking jihadist supporters, but among the Arabic-speaking core constituency, Afghanistan and Pakistan are not entirely firing their enthusiasm. Now, let me turn finally to this question of diminishing global support and how they are addressing this. And here, just as in the media environment, I would argue that they are not addressing it terribly well. If we look at the content of most of these Sahab productions in 2009, it is not fundamentally different from the content in years past. It is mainly an attempt to call attention to their successes and to drive home the message of a global jihad. There are certainly occasional attempts to present what one could call a kinder, gentler Al-Qaeda, one that does not target Muslims, but for the most part, the message has largely remained the same. And so I would say that on two of the three key communications challenges, Al-Qaeda has not come up with anything fundamentally new. And in the area where they have come up with something fundamentally new, it's not clear how much it's benefiting them with their core constituency. That is on the communications challenges. Very quickly, I would say that the media strategy, looking at it overall, is one of association and co-optation. So what Al-Qaeda tries to do, and Al-Qaeda Central is what I'm talking about here, not the affiliated groups, they themselves don't carry out daily operations. They are not enormously active, so they attempt to associate themselves with groups that are. In their case, it's mainly the groups that are geographically proximate to them, so this is the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban. And then at the same time, they try to co-opt any global struggle that fits into the global jihadist narrative. So for example, in February 2009, Ayman al-Zawahiri releases a statement that he titles From Kabul to Mogadishu. And this is a good example of how they are trying to insert themselves into every potential struggle from Kabul to Mogadishu. Now, this is a very interesting strategy when you contrast it, for example, to the Afghan Taliban, which has quite an active media operation now. The first thing that you notice is that it is much more geographically rooted, and it's very self-sufficient. The Afghan Taliban talk mainly about what they are doing in Afghanistan. They have an internationally directed media operation in many languages, but they talk about what they're doing on the home front. They talk about what they're doing on the home front, and at the same time, they note that they are locally rooted. So, for example, when the Afghan Taliban put out a press release in Arabic on the internet, there is contact information for spokespeople, Pakistan-based, that you can talk to for more information. It has a very concrete component. So, by comparison, looking at Al-Qaeda, I would say that they are virtual and parasitic. So they're virtual in that they exist in this world where they themselves, it's not entirely clear what they do. they try to provide strategic guidance to the global jihadist movement, but it is largely virtual. This is not to say that that's the case, of course, with the operations, as my colleagues have detailed, but on the media side we see that. And then it is parasitic in that they are really trying to co-opt all of these other conflicts and insert themselves. So that's where I would put the media strategy today. Now, two quick remarks on the relationship between communications and operations before my concluding remarks. Communications and operations are often very difficult to relate to one another because, of course, an organization can be saying one thing, it can be doing another. One of the difficulties we have in analyzing something like Al-Qaeda is trying to figure out what is the state of its operational capacity and how do you associate that with its communications capacity. I think that there's one interesting parallel that we've seen today. Some of my colleagues have talked about a blurring of the lines between Al-Qaeda and some of the groups that it's in geographic proximity with in Pakistan and to some extent in Afghanistan. If you look at some of the media reports we've seen, there was a very interesting piece about the Taliban in their own words, Taliban members talking about how the organization reconstituted itself in the period after 2001. And in those accounts, we heard various mysterious references to Arabs who would show up here and there. Those of you who watched the Frontline series earlier this week, Behind Taliban Lines, at one point in this narrative of fighters in northern Afghanistan, two mysterious fighters show up. One is an Arab and one is Pakistani. And we find these references throughout the literature of various Arab fighters. And I think one can say from these that there is a certain, interpenetration or seeding of Arab fighters who may or may not be Al-Qaeda linked in these other groups. We see the same interpenetration now in some of the media, where if you look at the Es-Sahab products that come out in 2009, some of them are associated very clearly with Al-Qaeda, some of them are associated very much with other groups that are in geographic proximity. The relationship is difficult to determine, and the question I would ask is, and I think the question that links the operational and communications level is Al-Qaeda colonizing other groups, or is it dissolving among them? Okay, I don't have the material to answer that right now, but I think that in looking at that question, we can start to bring together some of this material from the communications world and from the operational world. Now, let me move on to my concluding remarks about Al-Qaeda and strategic communications. I think that Al-Qaeda's external communications overall have become less effective since a high watermark in 2003 and 2005. Over the last 5 years, they have become less effective, mainly because of a changing media environment, because of Al-Qaeda's becoming embroiled in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and because of the general failure of the jihadist movement to achieve any positive results. Direct external interference, in other words, things that we are doing on the strategic communications front, that I think has been a lesser factor. This is not to denigrate the work of the people working in strategic communications on our side. I simply don't see as much evidence that that's a factor. I think Al-Qaeda is starting to decline on the external communications, but it's mainly because of these three factors I talked about. I think that on this strategic communications front, Al-Qaeda is not operating from a position of strength anymore. I think that we are not fighting Al-Qaeda on the communications front from a position of weakness. I would argue that one of our chief weapons in fighting Al-Qaeda is our understanding of the information environment. I think that identifying things like the weakness and trouble that Al-Qaeda has in Web 2.0 environments is important for us in going ahead to abet the further decline of their communications capacity. And then I'd like to also echo something that my colleagues talked about earlier today, which is the very small numbers of people who can wreak so much havoc and how this plays in to a communications environment. One of the problems is that the number of people who can create difficulties and cause mayhem and murder through a terrorist attack is in some ways below the threshold of where you can reduce something's popularity through strategic communications. You know, if you look at advertising and propaganda, we may win over 99% of an audience. If that 1% is still 1,000 people, in a terrorism perspective, that can still be a very large threat. So what I would say is that the gradual decay of al-Qaeda's communications capacity will make us safer, but it's never going to make us perfectly safe. Finally, I would say that as their communications capacity degrades in a changing information environment amid evidence that they are clearly failing to achieve some of their goals, the center of gravity in the fight against the message is going to move to a lot of niche environments, smaller environments, local environments, where that al-Qaeda narrative may still thrive. One thing I would say is that al-Qaeda over the last 10 years has diversified and localized its message quite effectively. There are now many local carriers of the message. If you look in North Africa, there is an al-Qaeda affiliate that, whatever its operational relationship to al-Qaeda, is providing a certain local message. We see the same thing in Somalia, for example, maybe in some parts of Pakistan, obviously. But this is, I think, where a lot of the fight is going to continue, even as al-Qaeda fails on the global level. And that for us, what this means practically in terms of policy is that the final stages of the struggle to reduce al-Qaeda to irrelevance, it's going to involve undermining the appeal of this narrative in these very specific local communities. And it's going to involve that much more than, say, strategic communications on the grand scale. So on that note, thank you very much.
Let me begin by thanking Steve for such a kind introduction, and thanking Steve and Peter and everyone here at New America for putting this together and for including me in the conversation. In some ways, I want to provide a bookend to what you just heard and talk a little bit about strategic communication, but from the government side, from the counter-terrorist rather than the terrorist perspective. And essentially, I'd like to put out two themes, or maybe two sub-themes, of today's focus on Al-Qaeda Central. The first one maybe as a corollary to a point that Paul started us out on this morning. He said training matters, and I certainly agree. And if training matters, then Al-Qaeda Central still matters. And my corollary might be that strategy matters, that as we hear more and more about homegrown or self-radicalized terrorists who find their way into involvement with Al-Qaeda for emotional or psychological or communal reasons, there are many, especially in Al-Qaeda Central, who still are strategically involved in this, who still are making a strategic assessment of the group's campaign and of America's response. So if strategy matters, Al-Qaeda Central still matters a lot. The second sub-theme is that if strategy matters, then signaling matters. And let me tell you what I mean by signaling here. What I mean is the idea that in counterterrorism, what countries like America do doesn't just accomplish things on the ground, so to speak. It also signals something. It projects some perceptions or impressions of the country as an actor. And so signaling matters because it's through the signals that a country like America says that those involved in the strategic debates on the jihadist side assess how the campaign is going and how America's reactions are or are not vindicating that campaign. So even though we're a year or 13 months into the current administration, I'm not sure we've seen the administration really settle into exactly what types of counter-terrorist signals they want to make the centerpiece of their approach to al-Qaeda. And so I want to begin by looking back a bit on some of the signals that were sent over the previous 8 or 9 years and trying to complicate the picture a bit by demonstrating what we now know about how those on the strategic jihadist side thought about those signals. And then I'd like to end with some implications moving forward. So one of the major themes of post 9/11 American counterterrorist strategy was in some ways a simple one, the idea that America was now active in prosecuting its counterterrorist campaign, that we heard a lot of rhetoric after 9/11 that we'd been too passive, too reactive in previous years, and now America was launching into action. The 2002 National Security Strategy said the only path to peace and security is the path of action, and various other strategies and officials made similar remarks. And more importantly, concrete policies on the ground substantiated that. We really did launch into action after 9/11 in Afghanistan, in Iraq, through the Predator strikes that have increased since. And what I want to emphasize is that obviously there were practical objectives of those things, but as my own research has revealed, those were really intended to serve as signals as well. There was a real sense that those drawn to al-Qaeda, those engaged in these strategic debates, might reassess their own campaign and might reassess America as a counterterrorist actor if these individuals could be disabused of the notion that America was passive, was reactive when it came to counterterrorism. So I want to just leave that on the table as signal number one. A second signal was the idea of demonstrating resolve, and this was in response to many statements by those involved with al-Qaeda that America had shown itself to be irresolute in running from Somalia, from Lebanon, even from Vietnam. So the 2006 National Security Strategy had the following: terrorists are emboldened more by perceptions of weakness than by demonstrations of resolve. And again, on the ground, concrete policies were intended to make this signal real. In fact, it's somewhat ironic, I guess, but as things became more complicated and in some ways got worse in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was something of an opportunity to show more and more resolve, that the U.S. would, in fact, see through these campaigns it had waged. So I want to put this on the table as a second signal intended. And finally, here at home, the idea for a signal was to show a visible, even ostentatiously built-up set of Homeland Security measures that would disabuse those drawn to al-Qaeda of the notion that, in fact, we were a weak or seductive target. So obviously there are practical intentions when you put big concrete barriers around tunnels and airports and those things, but again, the individuals involved in these decisions also saw this as signaling, as a form of showing the U.S. to be a better protected actor than the one al-Qaeda had originally targeted. And to be sure, these three types of actions, of taking action in response to an attack like 9/11, of showing resolve and trying to see through our campaigns, and of building up our defenses, make certain practical sense. On the signaling level, I want to complicate matters a bit. As signals, it seems to me these all imagine an adversary of a more traditional form than the one we were actually facing, an adversary eager to avoid American action, eager to keep America far from its reach, and so on. So I'd like to turn to what we now know about how those within the jihadist strategic community assessed these American signals. Taking action, to a certain extent, did concern those in the jihadist community. I think we went into Afghanistan, as others in this room have documented, in a manner not entirely expected by al-Qaeda and not entirely welcome to it. But in a certain sense, taking action vindicated a terrorist strategy, and al-Qaeda's strategy in particular. So Peter, in one of his books, quotes Saif Adel, who was at one point al-Qaeda's military commander, saying the following: our ultimate objective of the 9/11 strikes against the head of the serpent, meaning America, was to prompt it to come out of its hole. This would make it easier for us to deal consecutive blows to undermine it and tear it apart. And this is a familiar notion, I'm sure, to many in this room, the idea that terrorist strategy is a strategy of provocation, and that to launch into action on America's part was, in some ways, to make some practical progress, but in some ways to send a signal that vindicated the strategy that was being pursued by those involved with al-Qaeda. Turning to the demonstrations of resolve that I mentioned before. In fact, resolve in some ways seems to have paid off in Iraq, where things seem to be improving, at least for the moment, but as a signal, the matter is more complicated. We see a couple things in the discussions in the jihadist community. We see, first of all, an initial welcome, even relishing, of the idea that America, as al-Qaeda's enemy, was now close at hand, more vulnerable, potentially overstretched, and certainly off balance, operating in an environment with which it was not accustomed. And we see also, and Barbara mentioned this earlier, the idea that resolve for us and resolve for them mean very different things. That for us, we've been in Afghanistan really a long time, and Iraq, for American deployments abroad in the last century, really in America's history. For those drawn to al-Qaeda, this is not necessarily such a long time, certainly for those really taking seriously the strategic component. And we see, in a sense, a certain enthusiasm for this signaling of resolve, because it did, in a sense, vindicate what al-Qaeda sought to provoke through its terrorist campaign. And finally, in terms of America's actions at home, its homeland security measures, we see in jihadist debates an interesting aspect of this. We see, to be sure, some discussion of the idea that America now is defending itself better, but we also see quite a bit of discussion of what America was spending to do so. Zawahiri refers repeatedly to what he calls America's costly security budgets, and he's right, it's costly, and it's costly, as jihadist strategists have pointed out, in a way that America clearly didn't want to spend its resources. We weren't building giant barricades before 9/11. We had other things we wanted to do with our funds. Similarly, bin Laden has engaged rather extensively in calculations of how much we've spent at home and abroad in response to the 9/11 attack. So what I hope I'm conveying is a sense that the practical elements of these policies need to be seen in conjunction with their signaling component, by what they project to those in the jihadist strategic community about America and about America's response to al-Qaeda's campaign, and about whether that response, in fact, vindicates or causes a reassessment of that campaign. So real quickly, a couple of implications going forward. And one I really mentioned before, and it's in tune with today's theme of focusing on al-Qaeda Central. But that's not to lose sight of the strategic assessment and reassessment being engaged in by America's adversaries. While the self-radicalized and the homegrown may be drawn to terrorism for various reasons, there are those still who are quite serious about the strategic elements of what al-Qaeda is trying to do, and therefore they're watching closely what America does in response. Second, and this picks up with the Christmas Day bombing attempt that was mentioned by others before, that to me was a fascinating demonstration about what can be a distinction between short-term terrorist failure and potentially long-term terrorist success. So in the short term, the attack, thankfully, was clearly a failure. The plane landed successfully, the spectacular explosion that al-Qaeda sought didn't occur, and so on. But in the end, whether that's a strategic success or a strategic failure depends on how we respond. And we're seeing that now. We're seeing a debate among Americans as to how we should react in terms of homeland security measures, how we should react in Yemen and elsewhere. And it's really in the long term. It's in the provocation that does or doesn't occur, and how well that response is tailored by counter-terrorist governments to the threat they're actually facing, that long-term terrorist campaigns either find success or failure. Which leads to my final point, which is that same Christmas Day bombing attempt reveals that the crux of terrorism and counterterrorism and the dynamic between them lies in what we do every bit as much as what they do. And so that ties back into this notion of signaling, that what we do is in fact a signal to those in the strategic community around al-Qaeda, and it leads them to assess, reassess, and feel vindicated or otherwise about the campaign and how it's going on their end. So it's very much a dynamic that's as much about provocation and response as anything else. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. I'm going to take the moderator's self-appointed prerogative to ask you each one question before we open it to the floor. We're making pretty good time. Make sure there's time for questions from the floor as well. So, Josh, I wanted to ask you to go a little bit further with the observation you made that the Obama administration, in your judgment, may not have fully made up its mind about its signaling strategy in the ways that you were discussing. And in particular, the Christmas Day event that you concluded on is a reasonable case study of where things stand. I suppose you could see in the totality of government communications from the beginning over the course of the following 2 or 3 weeks some evidence of a desire to signal less action, less forceful resolve, more resilience, more sort of patience in some sense. And at the same time, that competed with an instinct toward the previous form of signaling that emphasized action, resolve, and sort of a forward defense. So first comment on that. And second, if the implication of your argument is that resilience and patience is a more effective signal given al-Qaeda's strategic view of the United States, what is the evidence or what is your analysis of how al-Qaeda actually reacts to signaled resilience and patience, as in the case of Tony Blair's speech after 9/11, where he essentially didn't talk about al-Qaeda or going after them at all. He just said, Britain carries on, and we're not going to be bothered by these folks.
On the Obama administration, I think that if we see an emerging trend from the administration, it's a trend towards, as you say, something of a quieter or more understated response. So we saw that at least initially in the response to the Christmas Day attempted attack, where you saw the president trying to stay out of the spotlight, at least at first, and to play it down. I think, as happens in communication generally, they may have lost control of the message a little bit because of particular unfortunate remarks from about whether things had in fact worked well or not on the American side. I think you saw the other extreme where populaces targeted by terrorism do need some reassurance. They do need some sense that their government is on top of the situation. And I think we may have seen a swing from one pole to the other there, which shows that it's very hard to find the sweet spot in between, where you're reassuring your public and at the same time being stoic and projecting to your adversaries a hesitancy to be riled up, in a sense. We also see that in the context of the predator strikes that have been a theme today. There have been, as we've seen, many more predator strikes, and yet we've in some ways heard less about them, or the tone in which we've heard about them has been somewhat more subdued. And so that may be the tendency, the inclination of this administration, and we may see it playing out gradually. On the second question, the question of what does resilience, what does patience in fact provoke or not provoke from those drawn to Al-Qaeda, we certainly know that it provokes frustration in certain instances. We know that after the USS Cole attack, there was frustration on bin Laden's part and Al-Qaeda's part that there was no notice for this. There was, I think, a presidential debate 3 days after that attack. It wasn't even mentioned there. So our sense is that there can be frustration, but then again, frustration can lead to ratcheting up attacks. So I think what others have written about, the idea of projecting a sort of a calm acknowledgement of the situation that does reassure the public, but in fact, as we've seen since the Christmas Day attack, approaches the question of, well, what do we do next? How do we get ahead of this? How do we deal with, in this instance, it seems Yemen and some of the problems that seem to be emanating this summer into this winter from Yemen-based training and potentially even Yemen-based direction. The idea that this is being done in conjunction with forces in the region, that's being done subtly and from afar, but hopefully still effectively, may be about as good a balance as you can find in this area.
Thank you. Dan, I wanted to ask you in a similar way to elaborate on something you said, which was you posed a question to yourself, so I'm going to ask you to answer it, which is whether or not the sort of interoperability of Assahab with South Asian groups, which you see evidence of sort of problems from a al-Qaeda strategy perspective because of the lack of interest in South Asia among, for example, Arabic-speaking forum participants. Whether what you're seeing there is the co-optation of the Taliban by al-Qaeda media capabilities or some sort of dissolving of al-Qaeda effectiveness into a regional insurgency that may end up being contained or co-opted into politics or other things that al-Qaeda clearly wouldn't sanction. So what do you think?
What do I think? One of the problems is that in today's media environment, things resonate literally everywhere at the same time. So, for example, everyone in this room should realize that because we are simulcasting on the web, if someone asks a question about Al-Qaeda's media strategy and I give a particularly convincing answer from the standpoint of jihadists, they can then put that clip on a jihadist forum and showcase this as an insight. So this is a complexity of the media environment that we all need to bear in mind. But this has, I think, ramifications for how al-Qaeda addresses these various audiences. And on the issue of whether al-Qaeda is dissolving in, to put it very crudely, in the Taliban, or the Taliban is becoming more like al-Qaeda, this is a little bit like the debate between Bruce Hoffman and Mark Sageman over whether it is still discrete organizations or bunches of guys. It's both. The Taliban communication effort today looks very much like the Al-Qaeda model. Okay, it is in at least their external communications in Arabic are very much on a jihadist model that was pioneered by Al-Qaeda. That said, some of the message is clearly divergent from the Al-Qaeda line. There are things that we can read in the Taliban's external communications that Al-Qaeda would not say. Al-Qaeda would not address the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and say that if we come to power in Afghanistan, we will strive to maintain good neighborly relations with our neighbors to the north. Okay? That said, there are things that you can find in the Taliban's communications that do seem to have come from Al-Qaeda. This is an unsatisfying answer, but My sense is that if I had to come down, I would say that Al-Qaeda is dissolving more in other groups rather than turning other groups into Al-Qaeda. I think that the core Al-Qaeda group of hardened international global jihadists who come from a fairly specific background in the Arab world through very numerous struggles that they all fought together, I think that when people from that environment then go out in small numbers in other larger groups, that it is they who tend to dissolve.
Thank you. So let's take 3 or 4 questions from the floor. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Lee Diamond. By way of identification, I associate myself with the president, the current president's policies. You guys have the really key topic, I think, and I guess I'm wondering for Josh where you see, the current administration ramping up a real public information campaign. I know that I don't follow them, but I know there's a ton of newspapers in Pakistan, and and to just mention, I mean, what you just said is critical because Al-Qaeda is making the astute choice to spread and to be like mercury, just you push it and it's gone, it's all over the place. So what do you see? My hope when this administration was coming was that we would see something like an international talk show on some radio network where they would be trying to engage people all over the world. I mean, there's a program like that on NPR. I forget what it's called.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've got it's a good question, and actually it sort of, if I can just adapt it slightly, you've spent all of this effort academically thinking about strategic communications, but as I read your quite excellent book, which I've announced the title of before, I didn't see you talk about public diplomacy as a self-conscious strategy of government per se. What do you think about the effectiveness of public diplomacy, and what would you forecast this administration's approach to be?
Let me start with what I'd like to see in terms of public information, which really might begin at home, actually. So we tend to hear our especially our government officials, talk about terrorism most in the immediate wake of a terrorist attack or failed terrorist attack, which makes a certain amount of sense, but is also in some ways the worst time to talk about it. It's the time when tempers have flared the most, people are most worried, and people say the most extremist things or the things that are then blown out of proportion and so on. In some ways, the best time to talk about terrorism and to educate in some ways our own populace is not in the immediate wake of an attack, but in the hopefully extended periods of calm in between, when in fact, our government has not done what the British government began to do at some point, which was to actually provide a sense of how terrorism works, that it is a strategy of provocation and response, that what we do abroad can feed into the very cycles that are part of the terrorist dynamic and the terrorist campaign. So I'd actually like to see us begin at home, in a sense, with what might be a very bland speech at a very uninteresting time, but a very useful one in the long run, talking about what terrorist strategy is. In terms of efforts abroad and public diplomacy, it's tough for us to discredit Al-Qaeda, but as Dan hinted at, it's actually quite possible for Al-Qaeda to discredit Al-Qaeda. And so to the extent that we subtly can continue to move around the internet and other media sources, some of the things you mentioned, like Zawahiri really struggling to deal with these questions. This virtual press conference did not turn out to be such a good thing. It revealed divisions, it revealed skepticism, it revealed a lot of frustration by people who, first of all, weren't happy with Al-Qaeda's direction in the first place, or weren't happy with what they saw as Al-Qaeda's new direction, or weren't happy with what they saw as petty rivalries between Al-Qaeda and Palestinian groups and others. To the extent that this may be something that we clear the stage of our own attempts to steal the message and allow these dissents from within to take center stage, that might be all for the best.
Let me just jump in and make 2 very quick points that in what we can broadly call information war, it's not a zero-sum game. It's perfectly possible for Al-Qaeda to lose a battle and the people who it's lost the battle with still hate the United States. Okay, so it's very important to realize it is not some kind of sliding barometer where among some population, loss for Al-Qaeda is going to mean gain for America. That is absolutely, I think, not how things work. And secondly, it is not always a head-on confrontation. There's often a desire among people who are involved in strategic communications and, to a lesser extent, public diplomacy to go out and confront the terrorist message. sometimes the best way to confront it is actually to ignore it. Sometimes the best way to confront it is to confront it, as Josh was saying. But I think it's important to bear in mind these two things, that it's not a zero-sum game, and it doesn't always involve head-on confrontation. That's one of the reasons it's so difficult to devise an effective strategy.
Are you holding the mic because you're going to ask the last question? Okay.
Yeah, thank you both for the very stimulating presentations. I wanted to ask Josh a question that connects with something Daniel said, which is, Al-Qaeda is sort of a parasitic communicator. And you produced two examples of their responses to things that the United States has done. One, their claim that that they cleverly enticed us into Afghanistan in order to win this guerrilla war against us, for which I think there's no actual factual evidence for. They were actually kind of surprised by the operation that actually happened. And secondly, bin Laden's claim that 9/11 was a great victory because it bled the United States so much. Yet, in fact, $500 billion was about 4% of American GDP at the time. So, yes, so those are both post facto rationalizations of things rather than actually really serious strategic responses in a way.
Yeah, I agree with that, and to the extent that I emphasized strategists within Al-Qaeda, Peter has written before that they're strategists, but they're not always good strategists, and in some ways they're better communicators after the fact than they are strategists before the fact, and I think that's absolutely right. They were able to turn things that weren't, in fact, necessarily practical victories in any sense into, to some extent, signaling victories, or at least things that kept what they saw as momentum going, and there is this part of the terrorist, counter-terrorist dynamic that's interesting, is that in some ways each component can be doing things that are counterproductive. So terrorism can often be quite counterproductive. As Peter has written about, bin Laden's aims in some ways seem further away than they seemed before 9/11. At the same time, things we've done in response have been counterproductive, and it's quite odd. Normally you see a sort of clash of strategies as two productive things rather than two counterproductive things. So sometimes you need to let counterproductivity play itself out to the extent you can, and maybe to the extent that victories are then claimed as signals, as matters of communication, try to let the elements within who recognize them otherwise clarify that.
Well, I admire all of you who stayed through the whole event. I wish I could tell you there was a bonus bagel on the way out, but I thank you for your attendance and attention and all the excellent questions. Thanks for our panel.